In order to understand what happens when we transition across cultures, it's helpful to have a way of thinking about culture. Clifford Geertz suggested that culture is an historically transmitted pattern of meanings embodied in symbols, a system of inherited conceptions expressed in symbolic forms by means of which men communicate, perpetuate, and develop their knowledge about attitudes toward life. Ruth Benedict said that culture is a more or less consistent pattern of thought and action. Cultures are more than the sum of their traits, and are an organic whole, which is above and beyond what individuals have willed and created. Culture has been called the software of the mind, and has been compared to an octopus and to an onion. It's easy to see why it can be complicated to understand what culture is when there are so many different ways of understanding culture. That's why one of the most popular explanations of culture is that it's like an iceberg. Like any approach to understanding culture, the iceberg metaphor has its own strengths and weaknesses. We'll talk about both. First, one of the big ideas of the iceberg is that it acknowledges that cultures have both visible and invisible elements. For example, we can often notice differences between cultures by paying attention to visible cues like clothing, food, holidays, housing, and greetings. Sometimes people have only really paid attention to these kinds of differences. Of course, paying attention to these kinds of differences can be useful, interesting, and informative, but there are so many more kinds of differences happening in cultures that when we only pay attention to what is above the waterline, we miss out on what's really going on, sometimes even with the things that we think we can see and understand above the waterline. To understand how culture is like an iceberg, it helps to understand a little bit more about icebergs. The mass of an iceberg is generally at least 87% below the waterline. One of the neat things about this metaphor is that the buoyancy of the iceberg is actually created by the volume of ice that is displacing denser water, like a boat does, which means that the visible part of the iceberg is literally supported by the invisible part. If we're going to understand an iceberg or culture, we're going to have to understand what happens at and below the waterline. The great thing is that we have tools like scuba diving or submarines that can help us to understand more about icebergs. The same is true for culture. We have tools like ethnography from the discipline of anthropology that can help us learn more about what's going on at and below the visible levels of culture. There are several different ways to explain what happens at and below the waterline, so don't be alarmed if this is different than what you're used to seeing. We'll come back to that problem when we talk about the weaknesses of the iceberg metaphor in a minute. One of the tricky things in culture is language. We'll place it here at the waterline. On the one hand, language is a visible element of culture. We can see it, or at least observe it being spoken around us. But language is actually really complicated. This is partly because of those elements of language that work alongside words to communicate meaning. Another complexity about language is that it actually can be involved with shaping what thoughts are perceived and expressed. There's a lot of controversy around this. Sapir, Worf, and Chomsky have a lot to say about it. But we can safely say that there's more going on with language than is apparent, even though it appears pretty easy to observe. Then there are the even more complicated ideas of beliefs and values. This is where you'll see some people list values first and others will list beliefs first, like we're doing. For our purposes, a belief is an understanding of the world that a person holds and knows that they hold. For example, many people have beliefs about the shape of the Earth. Some believe it to be round, while others believe it to be flat. Usually people are aware that they hold these kinds of beliefs. Another example would be beliefs about the meaning of being on time. For example, in some cultures, we believe that it is respectful to arrive at work on time, and in fact that it is right for you to lose your job if you don't arrive on time. Note that this is below the waterline, because while we can observe whether someone shows up on time or not, it is harder to observe what the beliefs are about showing up on time. Values, on the other hand, tend to be even more hidden. While we generally have some awareness of what we believe, values can help explain why cultures vary in what they believe. If we think about showing up on time as a way to understand a belief, we can think about the way we perceive the nature of time as happening on the value level. Some cultures perceive time as being a limited resource, linear, and unidirectional. These understandings are so deeply held that they are rarely expressed directly as beliefs, although there are sayings that point to these perceptions, such as time is money. However, there are other cultures that perceive time as being abundant, cyclical, and multi-channeled. Usually, these kinds of values are operating at a level that is beneath the awareness of most of us, even though our beliefs rely on them. Maybe that the belief that it's important to be on time to work relies on the perception that time is linear and is a limited resource. Usually, when this is the case, we believe our belief to be true without really knowing why we believe it to be true, and without expecting that any other culture would have a deeper meaning that would challenge our belief. By the way, Conan and Yusuf identified 25 different values constructs with 3 different possibilities each, so there are a lot of ways in which cultures can differ. Okay, so let's try tying this all together. Maybe we have an observable behavior, like someone showing up to work 10 minutes before their posted start time. Perhaps we ask them about it and they say, "Oh yes, I am always 10 minutes early." If we ask them why they arrive at that time, they might respond that it is important to be on time to show that you are responsible. This might point to an underlying value level understanding of time as a limited linear resource. If you were to question this value, there's a decent chance that they would get upset but not really be able to argue the point, as values are often invisible even to those that hold them. It is also possible that when you ask them about their behavior, they might have said that it is important to be 10 minutes early to demonstrate respect. Notice that although the behavior might be the same, there might be a different belief driving the behavior. If that is the case, it is possible that there is another value supporting this belief. For example, a value related to the meaning of authority. Again, if you were to inquire about this value, they might be confused about why you're asking. Values are so deeply held that they are simultaneously obvious and invisible. So we see that 2 people might demonstrate the same behavior but for different beliefs, which themselves are supported by different values. Indeed, they might not even have held the same values at all in arriving at the similar behavior. Imagine then the range of difference possible when there are different behaviors involved. The iceberg helps us ask questions about why people do what we do and what we perceive to be true about the world as we do it. So we mentioned earlier that there are downsides to the iceberg idea. The issue is that even though it can be useful to think of culture as an iceberg, culture is not an iceberg. Bennett wrote an article with this exact title. Think about the different metaphors we mentioned at the beginning: an iceberg, an onion, and a web. Each of these has its own strengths and weaknesses, but whichever metaphor we use is going to change the questions we ask about culture. It is more useful to understand culture as an ongoing process of negotiating meaning and of passing that meaning on to others. But that is rather harder to draw. So we stick with familiar metaphors like the iceberg, which is fine, as long as we know that the limitations are real and problematic and take appropriate steps to complexify our understanding.